Sure, great. Thank you for that kind introduction. When we go into Q&A, I'd love to learn a little bit more about who's on the meeting today and a little bit more about the GradCAMP, sort of its genesis and the purpose of this. So that'll help me a little bit more in the discussion. But from the general idea, I'm going to be providing some key theoretical, or not theoretical, but more like guiding framework that I use in my research. So this presentation is going to be a little bit on the shorter side, but it provides a big picture overview of the topics, ideas, and organizations that I work with in my community engaged research. And as Jennifer mentioned earlier, my research now increasingly focuses on climate-induced disasters, issues of environmental justice, and public health, and particularly how can community groups address some of these inequalities happening in those communities. And I do this in concert with community-based organizations, environmental justice groups, social justice, as well as migrant rights organizations. So I'll begin with this presentation. Let me make sure that everyone can see this now. Is that visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I want to start off with this flyer from one of my initial research projects for my book Climate Change from the Streets. And I think that this popular community flyer is very telling in terms of where we come in terms of issues of environmental justice and climate change. So this flyer, it was from 2010, March 29th, 2010. And it's from a group, a coalition of environmental and social justice organizations in Oakland, California, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. Oakland is particularly this part of Oakland. West Oakland is primarily in African-American, Latino, and Asian API community that experiences multiple forms of environmental impacts and environmental hazards, particularly because of industry, multiple freeways, and of course, the large port of Oakland, which is one of the largest ports in California. And from this flyer from about 13, almost 14 years ago, really is trying to put a human-centered approach to our work on climate change, and really trying to decenter this idea that climate change is happening out there in the wilderness, affecting ecosystems and not affecting the lives of individuals living in our urban streets and in our neighborhoods. So as you can read from this community flyer, it's not just about polar bears. So here they're trying to decenter that image that, again, climate change is happening outside of their local communities, that's mostly affecting polar bears and melting ice caps. So this is an image that's a tired image of climate change that we've seen for the last 20 years, that they, back 13, 14 years ago, they tried to decenter and focus on people and neighborhoods and the impacts happening in their local communities. So the title, further on, the text reads, "Climate Justice is about youth and the future of Oakland." So here was another example that they were one of the first groups in California that really tried to have this intergenerational approach to climate organizing and environmental justice organizing around climate change issues. And notice here how they emphasize the word youth, Y-O-U. So they're, again, focusing on the individual and not this abstract notion of what climate change. And that's further exemplified in one of the quotes from Brian Beveridge, who's the co-director of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, one of the largest environmental justice organizations in Oakland. He told me, quote, "Up until the last decade, climate change tended to be this white affluent issue about saving the rainforest and polar bears. It hasn't had deep relevance for people trying every day to get by in the urban centers. Most of the messages of climate change are about eliminating global greenhouse gas emissions and not about people." So again, emphasizing people, moving away parts per million around GHG emissions and centering people, and moving away from these abstract notions of impacts. So this eventually led me to my book, Climate Change from the Streets, because in California, it was important at the time to create representative messages and symbols, and particularly those that express the major challenges that the climate change crisis is happening to local communities. And this climate change crisis is happening at the same time that the state was experiencing racial unrest. And in the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters such as fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and economic recession at the time. And all these events are major life events, and these compounding disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. So hence really identifying what were the impacts happening at the local scale, how people were organizing around them, when multiple cumulative and compounding types of disasters and other types of impacts were happening to people in California and throughout the United States. So to address the climate emergency, activists and policymakers have proposed the Green New Deal at the federal level. Many of you recognize this or know this as a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy and address poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and are often met with significant resistance. So while I'm supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm here to say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like California for nearly 20 years have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists who favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. These conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science of climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to their effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions are claimed to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships, and all the competing interests, power, and racial struggles that this implies. So if we look towards the example of California, it reveals the contingent nature of climate change policy, the assumptions and social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. In California, tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, class, and race. These differences in worldview, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust, even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change would do to human societies and our planet. So for insight into national level conflicts between groups working on climate change, one should look to the nearly 2-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policy. For environmental justice activists in California, the main threat from climate change is the disproportionate harm it will cause to their bodies and the health of their communities. For them, climate change is not just about global greenhouse gas models. Rather, it is also about opposing worldviews through which policy and science is seen. Yet in California, it is still often seen as this homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural setting. It also obscures how the localization of environmental policy and science within the state involves processes of public conflict and legitimacy. For example, in this recent book that was published a couple years ago by a major university press, it describes the South as the definitive book on California's environmental history, from the founding Yosemite, John Muir, to modern times with California's passage of its Global Warming Solutions Act. And this 300-page or so book, in the entire book, people of color are only mentioned twice, and is done really in passing. So there's this traditional environmental narrative of California that facilitates the erasure of people of color in enacting comprehensive environmental policy and leadership. Therefore, I published my book, Climate Change from the Streets, with the explicit focus on people of color. My book foregrounds people place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality, and tells that untold story of how people of color, environmental justice groups were at the forefront of California's climate advancement agenda, and how they pushed the state not only to be a global environmental leader on climate change, but also a global leader and, most importantly, a national leader on climate justice or environmental justice. And many of the elements that we see in President Biden's Justice 40 were derived nearly 15 years ago from California's conflict and collaboration on environmental justice and climate change policies and agendas. But it's important to note and talk a little bit about my situated and lived knowledge of how it influences the research that I do. Moreover, this research, it's originated in my public policy work for the California State Legislature during a 15-year period. This provided me valuable insight into how the interaction of governments, businesses, and NGOs shape climate change policy. My research is further influenced by my experience growing up in Latino immigrant communities of Los Angeles that face multiple environmental threats. As the youth in places like Pacoima, Sylmar, and Lake Buteras, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental racism. Whether protesting the siting of landfills or organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties, they sought to understand how these situations originated, to develop alternatives, and to imagine new environmental futures. Thus, this has focused my work on what the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change has meant to activists, policymakers, experts, and scholars alike. Moreover, I have additional embodied and lived experience. My mother, who grew up in the Northeast San Fernando Valley, a largely immigrant suburb of Los Angeles, immigrant Latino and African-American suburb of Los Angeles, understood the failings of local schools. So she put me in a voluntary school busing program that was aimed to desegregate the West San Fernando Valley, which at the time was largely a white, affluent suburban community. And so I would wake up every morning, get on the bus around 6:30 or so, and ride the bus from the Northeast San Fernando Valley, a largely a community that was historically redlined, where only African Americans and Latinos could only purchase an entire region of the San Fernando Valley homes and rent out apartments. Saw the crumbling infrastructure, the lack of sidewalks, street lights, corner liquor stores, lack of green space. And slowly on that 15-mile drive on the school bus, I would see the change in the urban environment and how there was lots more natural resources within their urban environments, and more amenities to ensure that they had a healthier outcome and livelihood in that region. So that really led me to questions of why there was these stark differences in the urban environments, and in particularly one neighborhood experienced environmental injustices while the other ones had environmental privilege. At the same time, I was also influenced by my parents as well in terms of their business. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. My father had worked at the local General Motors auto plant in Van Nuys, California. That plant eventually closed and moved to Mexico, taking some good union jobs. At the age of 50, he gambled and invested his savings, his little savings he had, to open a bike shop in the local community of Pacoima. And this was the first Latino-owned bike shop in the entire region of the San Fernando Valley. At the time, there was over 1 million people in that entire region, but there was only, he was the first Latino to open a bike shop. And this was a largely low-income immigrant community. And so I saw the inequities in terms of infrastructure, in terms of transportation, that immigrant African Americans and other Latinos experience in terms of getting hit fatally by cars on their bicycle or as pedestrians. The lack of bicycle lanes, lack of sidewalks, lack of street lights. And I would see that on a daily basis, working as a teenager in his bike shop in a largely low-income neighborhood. This wasn't like the bike shops in wealthier communities where they're selling $2,000-$3,000 bikes. These were communities where they could barely afford to spend $40 on a new bike, let alone repairs. So that really influenced my outcome on the urban environmental issues and how infrastructure is intentionally withheld from individuals and communities, and why certain communities have disproportionate impacts when a disaster happens because of existing inequalities in the infrastructure and resources, and of course, crumbling infrastructure. So in closing, I just want to talk and highlight that this form of embodied research that I engage with, it examines new models of engagement with climate change and justice that make space for alternative paradigms of environmental protection. My engagement with key stakeholders since 2006 and even earlier has allowed me to critically analyze how the success of climate change policy in California and beyond now depends on incorporating marginalized voices and embodied perspectives from the local and global scales. This includes my own embodied knowledge and lived experience as a low-income individual living and growing up in an environmental justice community. So I look forward to hearing more about you, everyone on this call, about their research experiences and sort of how they incorporate lived and embodied experience in their research agendas. But before I go, I just want to talk a little bit about some other research projects that I have worked on that are community engaged. This one looks at the invisible victims of disaster, understanding the vulnerability of Latino and indigenous migrants in California. This largely focuses on wildfire impacts to farm workers in Sonoma County, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. Many of you know there's extreme wildfire events going on throughout the Southwest, particularly in California. And these individuals are often asked to labor in very toxic air quality conditions, heavy toxic smoke. They're often asked to enter into mandatory evacuation zones that are considered hazardous to the general population, but they're asked to go in there by their employers to safeguard and harvest wine grapes and other high luxury crops. So there's often a lot of attention placed on the economic value of these crops, with little attention on the actual impacts happening to these farm worker communities. I wrote this article and a couple, two subsequent articles with environmental justice and indigenous migrant leaders that were at the front lines of these climate-induced disasters, wildfires in this case. And it's been a very powerful type of project where we were able to work jointly to do policy and media briefings to local, state, national, and even international policymakers and experts, including at the federal level, FEMA, NOAA, NASA, and of course at the state level, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. And what I'm most proud of is myself and the advocates were able to present to the United Nations Migration Agency, who are really interested in understanding what can the global community learn about climate migrants, climate refugees, or climate displacement. So while this is a very California-focused experience on disaster and wildfires, extreme wildfire events are happening all over the world, creating displacement and impacts to migrant and farm worker communities from Greece, Brazil, to Australia. And it was a great exchange to talk about these issues. And we're also going to host later this month with UN Habitat, which is the United Nations sort of urban planning, urban development arm, a similar webinar, but with more focused on some international migrants from other countries. Other types of work that I've extended to this is to extreme flooding. In places like California, we have hydrochromatic whiplash or climate whiplash, where we go from one extreme to the other. In this case, from extreme drought, several years of extreme drought, to extreme flooding. So the picture on the left-hand side is Pájaro, California, which is in the northern part of Central California. not too, maybe about a half an hour or so north of the Santa Cruz. And this was largely a farm worker community. And there was torrential rains that happened, and a levee broke. But the thing with this is that this levee was vulnerable for many decades. Policymakers at the national, federal, and local level knew for decades that this levee was vulnerable, and the largely low-income migrant farm worker communities would be heavily impacted. And the levee finally did broke earlier this winter of this year, and flooded hundreds of homes of farm workers, and only a handful of them actually had flood insurance. On the other side, and that's an opinion piece that I wrote in the Los Angeles Times about this issue, which highlights that what happened in Pájaro isn't just a natural disaster. And that piece I co-wrote with Manuel Pastor at USC really highlights that these issues of disaster are historical in nature. And I compare this to the St. Francis Dam disaster that happened in 1928. This St. Francis Dam was developed by Mulholland. He's the famous engineer, developer, and booster of Los Angeles. He brought water from Northern California to Southern California, and hence helped with the rapid development of Los Angeles. For those on the East Coast, he's very similar to Robert Moses of New York City. So Mulholland was a self-taught engineer, had a lot of success in bringing water to California, but this St. Francis Dam eventually was his downfall. This was the last major public works project that he developed in northern Los Angeles County. He developed his dam in a very rapid manner, in unsuitable terrain and suitable soil, and eventually that dam burst, and billions of gallons of water went from Northern California to the neighboring county of Ventura County, California, and it created this flood path of mostly low-income individuals, and specifically low-income Latino Mexican farm workers. And the issue with this is when this dam did burst and affected these largely migrant farm workers, many of these farm workers were unidentified. They were washed away to sea, or their bodies were collected and they put them in a mass grave. And they continue to, if you could go visit their unmarked graves in Ventura County. Also, archival research that I did really shows discrimination and disaster response. The American Red Cross refused to provide mutual aid to the migrant farm workers. They had to request mutual aid from a Mexican focused organization in the San Fernando Valley, about 30, 50 miles away, to come provide mutual aid. And there's also accounts that the Anglo disaster victims were complaining that they were being put in shelters along with migrant farm workers. But I bring these two examples because one of the eerie facts that I highlight in this Los Angeles Times op-ed is that 94 years to the date, March 12th, 1928 and March 12th, 2023, almost 94 years to the date, actually to the date, that these disproportionate disaster impacts around water and flooding affected the same population, and the outcomes, unfortunately, are quite similar. So there's this historical nature of disproportionate impact to farm worker communities. And it's not just a natural disaster. In the social sciences, I think some of you are social scientists, we do not name things as natural disaster. We name them as a disaster because many of these disparate impacts to disaster are political choices that have been made that intentionally withhold resources from one community to the other. Other examples of this could be Hurricane Katrina that affected New Orleans, and Ward 9, which was a heavily African-American ward or neighborhood. And again, the policymakers and experts knew for decades that the levees around Ward 9 would collapse, would fail if a major storm would hit that community, but yet there was inaction. around to safeguard and protect these communities. So we see this similar in California around flooding on extreme weather events in California with migrant communities. Another research project that I've been working on is understanding the disparate impacts of disasters on LGBTQ plus communities. And in this research that I did with other LGBTQ co-authors, explores how and why LGBTQ plus communities are affected legally, psychologically, physically, and even theologically during disasters. So this was one of the first nationwide kind of assessment of how LGBTQ communities are disproportionately impacted from disasters. Other scholars have focused on specific case studies or more in the international context, but this was one of the first that looked at the United States at a nationwide, and it really shows that LGBT communities have disparate outcomes, particularly low-income LGBTQ people of color. So in our research, we really push forward this this notion that we must dispel the myth of gay affluence. That is where we think of LGBTQ people are largely being white, male, and wealthy. Very images of LGBT people are Will and Grace and other upwardly mobile, fashionable types of LGBT queer communities. But here we really put the notion forward that the very same social vulnerability factors that make the general population vulnerable to disasters are heavily prevalent in LGBTQ communities of color. So we also had a lot of articles and newspaper coverage with this. We teamed up with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to launch this research and highlight the studies. This was the first time FEMA ever participated on an LGBT disaster-focused type of event. We also did workshops with NOAA and had a lot of media coverage, as well as the other work we did with farm workers. Luckily, this has been an issue we were able to take from a theoretical analysis to something that's applied that has garnered interest from policymakers, media, and other community leaders. So that's a very broad overview of my research and sort of my embodied and lived experience, and where I've gone from, studying climate change and environmental justice from California and globally to these more kind of discrete case studies and analyses of some of the most marginalized and stigmatized populations, undocumented migrants, and LGBTQ plus populations. So thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mendez.